Hello, and welcome back to Code Your English, the channel where you improve your English while discovering powerful ideas that can transform the way you think, work, and live. I'm truly excited to have you here. Somewhere right now, in a city you will never visit, there is a person sitting in front of a blank document, or standing outside a gym they have never entered, or holding a phone with an unsent message glowing on the screen. And that person is telling themselves the exact same sentence you have probably told yourself more than once. I'll do it when the time is right. Say that sentence out loud right now, slowly, and really listen to how confident it sounds. It sounds responsible. It sounds wise, even. But here is the uncomfortable truth we are going to sit with today. That sentence has quietly stolen more dreams, more languages, more relationships, and more versions of ourselves than almost anything else in human life. Today, we are not going to talk about grammar rules or vocabulary lists, even though you will absolutely pick up a lot of powerful English along the way. Today, we are going to talk about waiting, the invisible habit that feels like patience but is often something else entirely. By the end of this episode, something in you is going to shift. You are going to understand, on a much deeper level, why your brain resists starting things, why the perfect moment is one of the most convincing lies we tell ourselves, and, most importantly, you are going to walk away with a simple, honest framework you can use today. Not next Monday, not in January, not when things calm down. Today. And along the way, we are going to practice English together, out loud, the way you would if you were sitting across from a close friend who happens to be a little bit obsessed with helping you speak fluently and live courageously at the same time. The perfect moment is a trap. Let me ask you something, and I want you to actually pause and think about your answer instead of rushing past it the way we usually do. How many things have you told yourself you would start someday? Maybe it's speaking English with confidence instead of silently translating every sentence in your head before you say it. Maybe it's applying for that job that feels slightly out of reach. Maybe it's finally starting to exercise, or write, or travel, or forgive someone, or leave a situation that has stopped making you happy a long time ago. We all have a list like this, even if we've never written it down on paper. It lives quietly in the back of our minds, and every few weeks it taps us gently on the shoulder and whispers, "Not yet." We wait for more time. We wait for more money. We wait for more confidence, more knowledge, more energy, a better mood, a clearer sign from the universe that this is indeed the moment. And here's the strange part. Waiting often feels like the mature, sensible choice. It feels like patience, like wisdom, like we are simply being careful instead of reckless. But there is a very important difference between being patient and quietly putting your life on hold. And most of us have never stopped long enough to notice which one we are actually doing. Patience means you are actively moving forward while accepting that results take time. Waiting, the kind we are talking about today, means nothing is moving at all, except the calendar. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. And one day, we look back and realize that someday never actually arrived, because someday isn't a date. It was never going to knock on our door and introduce itself. It was always something we were supposed to create, not something we were supposed to wait for. So here is your first reflective question of the episode, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Maybe even pause this episode for 10 seconds after I ask it. What is something you keep telling yourself you'll do when the time is right? Hold that answer in your mind. We are going to come back to it. Speak in practice moment. I want you to say this sentence out loud, in English, right now, filling in your own answer. I keep waiting for the right time to blank. Don't worry about perfect grammar. Just say it. Feel how it sounds coming out of your mouth. That small act of honesty is the beginning of everything we're going to talk about today. The perfect moment is a trap. Let me ask you something, and I want you to actually pause and think about your answer instead of rushing past it the way we usually do. How many things have you told yourself you would start someday? Maybe it's speaking English with confidence instead of silently translating every sentence in your head before you say it. Maybe it's applying for that job that feels slightly out of reach. Maybe it's finally starting to exercise, or write, or travel, or forgive someone, or leave a situation that has stopped making you happy a long time ago. We all have a list like this, even if we've never written it down on paper. It lives quietly in the back of our minds, and every few weeks it taps us gently on the shoulder and whispers, "Not yet." We wait for more time. We wait for more money. We wait for more confidence, more knowledge, more energy, a better mood, a clearer sign from the universe that this is indeed the moment. And here's the strange part. Waiting often feels like the mature, sensible choice. It feels like patience, like wisdom, like we are simply being careful instead of reckless. But there is a very important difference between being patient and quietly putting your life on hold. And most of us have never stopped long enough to notice which one we are actually doing. Patience means you are actively moving forward while accepting that results take time. Waiting, the kind we are talking about today, means nothing is moving at all, except the calendar. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. And one day, we look back and realize that someday never actually arrived, because someday isn't a date. It was never going to knock on our door and introduce itself. It was always something we were supposed to create, not something we were supposed to wait for. So here is your first reflective question of the episode, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Maybe even pause this episode for 10 seconds after I ask it. What is something you keep telling yourself you'll do when the time is right? Hold that answer in your mind. We are going to come back to it. Speaking practice moment. I want you to say this sentence out loud, in English, right now, filling in your own answer. I keep waiting for the right time to blank. Don't worry about perfect grammar. Just say it. Feel how it sounds coming out of your mouth. That small act of honesty is the beginning of everything we're going to talk about today. Why we keep waiting. Now, I don't want this episode to feel like I'm judging you, because I promise you, I am not. Every single person listening to this, including the person writing these words, has a long, complicated relationship with waiting. So let's understand it together instead of criticizing ourselves for it, because understanding is always more powerful than shame. At the root of most waiting, you'll usually find fear, specifically the fear of failure and the fear of making the wrong decision. There's a quiet voice in our heads that says, "What if I try and it doesn't work? What if I speak English and people laugh at my mistakes? What if I start this business and it collapses? What if I'm simply not good enough?" This voice isn't trying to hurt us, by the way. In a strange way, it thinks it's protecting us. It believes that if we never try, we can never truly fail. But of course, that protection comes at an enormous price, because refusing to try is its own kind of failure. A quieter one that doesn't announce itself loudly, but slowly accumulates in the background of our lives. Then there's perfectionism, which is one of the most beautifully disguised forms of fear that exists. Perfectionism convinces us that we need a flawless plan before we take a single step, that every detail must be arranged, every risk eliminated, every outcome predicted before we are allowed to begin. It sounds like ambition. It sounds like high standards. But very often, it's simply fear wearing a much nicer outfit. Add to this our natural attachment to comfort zones, those familiar spaces where nothing surprises us, where we know exactly what to expect, even if what we expect isn't particularly satisfying. And our deep desire for certainty before we commit to anything, and you start to see the full picture. Waiting protects us from temporary discomfort today, but it often creates long-term regret tomorrow. And regret, as most people will tell you later in life, weighs far more heavily on the heart than the temporary sting of an honest attempt that didn't go perfectly. Here's an idea I want you to hold on to for the rest of this episode. Sometimes we don't wait because we're unprepared. We wait because we're afraid. Read, or rather listen to, that sentence one more time, because it quietly explains almost everything about human hesitation. Let me tell you about a student of mine named Elif. Elif joined one of my classes almost 2 years ago, and from the very first lesson, I could tell she had a strong instinct for language. She understood grammar structures quickly. She picked up new vocabulary almost effortlessly. And yet, every single time I asked the class a question, Elif would look down at her notebook instead of raising her hand. Weeks passed. Months passed. She was clearly capable, but she rarely spoke. One day, after class, I asked her gently why she was so quiet, and she told me something that has stayed with me ever since. I don't want to speak until my English is good enough. I remember pausing for a moment before I answered her, because I wanted my next sentence to actually mean something to her. I said, "Elif, your English will never feel good enough to you if you never use it. Speaking isn't the reward for becoming fluent. Speaking is how you become fluent." She sat with that for a moment, and something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but quietly, the way real change usually begins. Speaking practice moment. Try repeating this phrase out loud, exactly as I say it. I don't need to feel ready. I need to begin. Say it once quietly, and then say it again with more conviction in your voice, as if you actually believe it. Because by the end of this episode, I hope you will. There's something else worth mentioning here, something that rarely gets discussed openly enough. Comfort zones aren't actually comfortable in the deepest sense of the word. They're simply familiar. And we often confuse the two without realizing it. A comfort zone might mean staying quiet in meetings even though you have valuable ideas to share. It might mean avoiding English conversations even though part of you desperately wants to connect with people from different cultures. Familiarity feels safe because it's predictable, but predictable and fulfilling are not the same thing at all. Many people spend years, sometimes decades, inside a comfort zone that never actually brought them comfort. Only the illusion of safety, purchased at the price of growth. The myth of when everything is ready. Let's challenge a belief that most of us carry around without even questioning it. The belief that successful people only begin when conditions are ideal. Think about the thoughts that probably run through your own mind on a regular basis. I'll start when I have more time. I'll apply for that job when I have more experience. I'll speak English once my grammar improves. I'll start exercising next Monday. I'll change my life once things become a little less stressful. Do any of these sound familiar? I would guess that at least one of them does, because these thoughts are almost universal. They cross cultures, languages, and generations. Here's the problem with all of them. Life rarely, if ever, becomes perfectly convenient. There is no future version of your life where every obstacle has magically disappeared and every condition has aligned itself neatly for your comfort. The person who starts learning a new language while life is messy and unpredictable is the same person who will still be learning that language 5 years later. The person who waits for the ideal moment to start is often still waiting 5 years later too. Except now the list of excuses has simply gotten longer and more sophisticated. Think about how much emotional power we give to certain dates on a calendar. Monday becomes this mythical, magical starting line. January the 1st becomes a symbolic reset button for our entire existence. We treat these dates as if they contain some kind of special energy that will make starting easier, when in reality, a date on a calendar has never once created motivation on its own. Action creates momentum. Not Mondays, not New Year's Day. Action. I think about Thomas, another student from my class, who told me once that he had been planning to start speaking English in real conversations, not just studying grammar exercises alone at home, but actually talking to real people, for almost 3 years. 3 years of preparing to prepare. 3 years of buying new textbooks, downloading new apps, watching new tutorials, and somehow never quite reaching the point where he felt ready to open his mouth and simply speak. And I want to be very clear here, because this is an important distinction. There is a real difference between preparing to start and endlessly preparing to start. The first one has an ending point. The second one is simply a comfortable disguise for avoidance, one that even fools the person doing it, because it feels productive on the surface, even while nothing actually moves forward underneath. Speaking practice moment. Describe out loud, in a few full English sentences, one thing you have been preparing to start for longer than you'd like to admit. Try to actually name the thing specifically, rather than staying vague. Vague excuses are much easier to hide behind than specific, honest ones. Progress is usually messy. Now let's talk about something that almost nobody says out loud clearly enough. Your first attempt at anything worthwhile is very rarely impressive, and that is not a sign of failure. It is simply the nature of how growth works. Every fluent English speaker you have ever admired once sounded exactly like a beginner. Every confident public speaker once had a shaking voice and sweaty palms the first time they stood in front of an audience. Every skilled writer once produced pages that, if we're being completely honest, were probably not very good at all. We need to reframe setbacks and awkward beginnings as a natural part of the process, not as evidence that we should quit, or that we were never suited for this in the first place. I remember starting this very channel, Code Your English, years ago, and looking back at my very first videos genuinely makes me cringe a little. My lighting was uneven, my structure was disorganized, and my delivery was nowhere near as confident as it is today. If I had waited until I felt ready to create something polished and professional, this channel, the one that has now reached thousands of learners across the world, would simply never exist. The version of the plan I had in my head was nothing like the messy, imperfect first version I actually released into the world. And that gap, that uncomfortable space between what we imagine and what we actually produce at the beginning, is something every single person who has ever built anything meaningful has had to walk through. There is also a particularly uncomfortable stage that many learners experience, and I want to name it clearly, because naming a feeling often takes away some of its power over us. It's the stage where you are no longer a complete beginner in theory. You understand the grammar, you know a wide range of vocabulary, you could probably pass a written test with a good score. And yet, in practice, in real conversations with real people, you still feel inexperienced and hesitant. This gap between theoretical knowledge and practical fluency frustrates so many learners, and it often makes them believe something is wrong with them, when actually, this stage is simply part of the natural bridge between knowing a language and truly living inside it. Part of what makes this stage so painful is that we constantly compare our own beginning to someone else's finished, polished product. We watch a fluent speaker on YouTube and forget that we are comparing our Chapter 1 to their Chapter 20. We see a confident colleague speaking effortlessly in a meeting and forget the hundreds of awkward, imperfect conversations that came before that moment of ease. Here is the sentence I want you to remember from this section. Maybe even write it down somewhere. You'll see it again. You don't need to be good at something before you start. Starting is how you become good at it. There is enormous relief hidden inside that sentence, and I hope you feel a small piece of that relief right now, because it means you are finally allowed to begin exactly where you are, with exactly the skills you currently have. Speaking practice moment. Try describing out loud in English your very first attempt at something, anything, that eventually became easier with practice. Notice how the story naturally proves the point we just discussed. Start before you feel ready. Let's move now from understanding the problem toward something much more practical, because insight without action is simply an interesting thought that changes nothing. Here is something that surprises a lot of people the first time they truly understand it. Confidence almost always comes after action, not before it. We tend to believe the order works the other way around, that we need to feel confident first, and only then can we act. But real life rarely works that way. Think about it as two very different cycles. The first cycle looks like this. Action leads to experience. Experience leads to learning. Learning leads to improvement. Improvement leads to confidence. And confidence leads to even more action. It's a cycle that feeds itself, growing stronger each time you move through it. The second cycle, unfortunately, is the one most of us default to without realizing it. Doubt leads to waiting. Waiting leads to no experience. No experience leads to more doubt. And more doubt leads to even more waiting. This second cycle also feeds itself, except it spirals downward instead of upward. And the longer we stay inside it, the harder it becomes to escape. The way out is almost embarrassingly simple to describe, even though it can feel genuinely difficult to practice. Take small, imperfect steps. Speak English even when you know you'll make mistakes. Send the application even if you don't meet every single requirement listed in the job posting. Start exercising for just 10 minutes instead of waiting until you can commit to a full hour. Write the first paragraph of your story instead of trying to plan every chapter of the entire book before you've written a single word. I want to bring Elif back into this conversation for a moment because her story continues in a way I think you'll appreciate. A few weeks after our conversation about speaking before feeling good enough, Elif raised her hand in class for the first time. Her sentence wasn't perfect. She mixed up a verb tense. She paused a few times to find the right word. But she said it, out loud, in front of the entire class. And here's what struck me most. Nobody laughed. Nobody judged her. The class simply listened, and when she finished, a few classmates nodded in that quiet, encouraging way people do when they recognize courage. Elif told me afterward that the sentence itself felt small, almost insignificant, but the decision to speak felt enormous. That's often exactly how meaningful change works. The action itself is small, but the internal shift behind it is massive. So here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. What could you begin today if you stopped demanding confidence from yourself first? Not next week, not once you feel ready. Today. Speaking practice moment. Complete this sentence out loud, using your own real situation. Today, even though I don't feel fully ready, I am going to blank. Say it with your full voice. not a whisper. Let yourself hear the commitment in it. The power of small, consistent actions. Starting matters enormously, but starting alone is not the whole story. What actually creates lasting, meaningful change is consistency, and consistency, unfortunately, is far less exciting than a dramatic, sudden transformation. We love the idea of dramatic change. We love stories about people who completely reinvented their entire lives overnight. But in reality, those stories are rare, and even when they happen, they are usually built on a foundation of small, unglamorous, repeated actions that nobody filmed or posted online. Consistency is a quieter force, but it is far more reliable than motivation ever will be, because motivation rises and falls depending on your mood, your energy, and your circumstances, while consistency simply requires you to show up again, and again, and again, regardless of how you feel on any particular day. This is sometimes called the compound effect. The idea that small actions, repeated steadily over time, eventually produce results that feel disproportionately large compared to how small and simple each individual action originally seemed. Think about language learning specifically, since that's the world we live in together on this channel. 10 minutes of speaking practice today might feel almost pointless in isolation. But 10 minutes of speaking practice, repeated consistently across 6 months, quietly transforms into genuine fluency. The same principle applies to fitness, where a short daily walk eventually reshapes your health far more reliably than one exhausting, unsustainable workout, followed by weeks of nothing. It applies to reading, where a few pages each night slowly builds into dozens of completed books over a year. It applies to careers, to relationships, and to nearly every meaningful personal habit you could name. There's a helpful way to think about this. Compare the idea of one perfect day with the idea of small progress every day. One perfect day, a day where everything goes exactly right, where you're fully motivated, fully energized, fully focused. Sounds appealing, but it's fragile and rare. Small progress every day, on the other hand, doesn't depend on perfect conditions at all. And here's something important to remember. On the days when you inevitably slip, missing one day is not failure. Missing one day is simply being human. The real danger isn't a single missed day. It's repeatedly abandoning the entire process every time life gets a little difficult or a little inconvenient. Here's the central idea I want you to carry with you from this section. You don't need a perfect day. You need a direction and the willingness to keep going. Read that again if you need to. Direction and willingness. That's really all consistency requires. Speaking practice moment. Describe, in a few complete English sentences, one small action you could realistically repeat every single day for the next 30 days, related to something you genuinely care about improving. I want to pause here and celebrate something small with you, because small victories deserve genuine recognition, not just quiet acknowledgement buried under bigger goals. If you have ever finished a lesson you almost skipped, said one sentence in English you were nervous to say, or shown up on a day you really didn't feel like showing up, that counts. That genuinely counts. We tend to save our celebration for enormous milestones, the big graduation, the fluent conversation, the finished project, and we forget to celebrate the quiet, unglamorous moments that actually built the foundation for those milestones in the first place. Confidence isn't built in one dramatic moment. It's built in hundreds of small moments that nobody else even notices. Moments where you chose to show up instead of waiting one more day. So if today, right now, listening to this episode, counts as one of those moments for you, then let this be a small celebration of that choice. What if it doesn't work? Now I want to address something honestly, without falling into unrealistic, overly cheerful motivational language, because you deserve an honest conversation, not empty encouragement. Sometimes starting doesn't lead to the result we hoped for. Sometimes we try, and we still experience rejection. Sometimes our plans fail. Sometimes we make decisions that, looking back, weren't the right ones. This is real, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But here's what's genuinely important to understand. Action doesn't guarantee success, but it gives us something waiting never can: information, real experience, and new possibilities that simply didn't exist before we tried. When Thomas finally started speaking English in real conversations after those 3 long years of preparing, his first few conversations were far from smooth. He stumbled over words. He misunderstood a question once and gave a completely unrelated answer, which made both him and the other person laugh. But those imperfect conversations gave him something his 3 years of silent preparation never could: real, lived experience of what it actually feels like to communicate in English under real conditions, with real people, in real time. It's worth taking a moment to separate a few ideas that we often lump together carelessly: failure, feedback, a setback, and a final decision. Failure suggests something is permanently over. Feedback simply tells you what worked and what didn't, so you can adjust. A setback is a temporary obstacle, not a life sentence. And changing direction after trying something is not necessarily giving up at all. Very often, it's simply new information guiding you toward a better path than the one you started on. Let me leave you with a question that I think cuts right to the emotional heart of this entire episode. Which would you regret more? Trying and discovering that something wasn't right for you, or never trying at all and spending years quietly wondering what might have happened if you had? Sit with that question honestly for a moment, because I think, deep down, most of us already know the answer. Speaking practice moment. Try saying this sentence out loud, and really notice how it feels in your mouth and in your chest as you say it. I would rather try and be disappointed than never know what could have happened. Say it slowly. Say it like you mean it. Stop asking, when? And start asking, what can I do now? Let's turn everything we've discussed into something genuinely practical, something you can actually use the moment this episode ends. I want to introduce a simple framework I call now, not someday. And it works through 5 gentle, honest steps. First, name it. Be specific about what exactly you've been postponing. Vague intentions are easy to avoid. Specific, named intentions are much harder to ignore. Second, shrink it. Ask yourself what the smallest possible first step could realistically look like. Not the entire journey, just the very first tiny movement forward. Third, schedule it. Decide exactly when you will take that step. Not soon, not this week sometime. An actual moment, a specific time on a specific day. Fourth, accept imperfection. Decide in advance what you will do even if you feel nervous, unprepared, or uncertain when that moment finally arrives, because it's very likely that you will feel exactly that way. And deciding now means you won't have to decide in the middle of your own hesitation later. And fifth, repeat it. Think about how you can transform that first small step into a consistent, repeated pattern, rather than a single isolated event that never happens again. Let me give you two quick examples of how this sounds in practice. Instead of saying, "I need to learn English," which is vague, overwhelming, and honestly a little intimidating, you could say, instead, "Tonight, I'll speak English out loud for 10 minutes, even if I'm alone in my room." Instead of saying, "I need to change my career," which feels like an enormous, frightening mountain to climb, you could say instead, "Today, I'll research one course or update one single section of my CV." Notice how much smaller, calmer, and more achievable these rewritten sentences feel compared to the original versions. That shrinking process is not weakness, it's strategy. I'd like you to pause the episode right now, just for a moment, and mentally walk through these 5 steps using your own real situation, the one you thought about earlier when I first asked what you've been waiting for. Speaking a practice moment, say your own personal now, not someday plan out loud, using all 5 steps, in full English sentences. Naming it clearly, out loud, in your own voice, is often the moment an idea starts to feel real instead of theoretical. The moment you've been waiting for. Let's come back now to where we began. Life will probably never become completely predictable, completely convenient, or completely free of uncertainty. And I say that not to discourage you, but to free you from an expectation that was never realistic in the first place. Courage, real courage, doesn't mean the absence of fear. It never has. Courage means moving forward while uncertainty is still very much present, while your hands are still slightly shaking, while your voice still trembles a little on that first sentence. Please don't wait for a new year to begin, or a Monday, or a sudden burst of confidence that magically arrives, or permission from someone else who was never actually required to give it. Your first attempt is allowed to be imperfect and still be deeply meaningful. In fact, it almost certainly will be imperfect, and that imperfection doesn't diminish its meaning at all. If anything, it deepens it, because it proves you were brave enough to begin honestly, exactly as you are, rather than waiting for a more polished version of yourself that may never fully arrive. So let's slow down together for these final moments, and I want you to really sit with each of these questions rather than rushing past them. What have you been waiting for? What is actually stopping you from starting? Not the surface-level excuse, but the real, honest reason underneath it? What would happen if you gave yourself permission to begin imperfectly, right now, exactly as you are? What is one small action you could take today, not tomorrow, not next week, today? And if you took that same small action consistently, patiently, for the next 6 months, how do you imagine your life might look different by the end of it? I'll leave you with this thought, and I genuinely hope it stays with you long after this episode ends. The perfect moment isn't something you find, waiting patiently out there in the world for you to stumble upon it. Sometimes it's something you create, quietly and deliberately, by simply deciding to begin. Your challenge this week. Here is a small, completely achievable challenge for you before our next episode together. Choose one single thing you've been postponing. Just one, not an entire list. And take the smallest possible first step toward it within the next 24 hours. It doesn't need to be impressive. It doesn't need to be perfect. It simply needs to happen. I'd love to know, what is one someday goal you're finally going to turn into a today action after listening to this episode? Be specific in your comment. Tell me exactly what the small first step will look like. and when you plan to take it. I read every single comment, and I promise you, naming it publicly, even in a short comment below, makes it just a little bit more real. In our next episode, we're going to explore a topic that connects beautifully to everything we discussed today. What actually happens after you take that first brave step? When the initial excitement fades and the real, everyday work of consistency begins. We'll talk honestly about motivation, discipline, and what truly separates people who start something from people who actually continue it long enough to see real change. I don't want you to miss that conversation, so make sure you're subscribed and ready. Before you go, remember, you don't need to feel ready. You simply need to begin. I'll see you very soon in the next episode. Until then, keep speaking, keep practicing, and keep choosing today over someday.